He thought he was untouchable. He thought his sharp mind and biting words could silence centuries of faith. But in Springfield, Missouri, the very heart of the Bible Belt, where crosses stand taller than billboards and Sunday hymns echo louder than protests, Ethan Miller decided to make a spectacle that no one would forget. Ethan was 21, a philosophy student whose brilliance was as undeniable as his defiance. He had grown up gay in a place where pews were full, but hearts were closed. Every sermon, every side glance, every hushed whisper reminded him that he was unwanted. He hid his hurt behind arrogance, sneering at the beliefs of those who had pushed him out. To his professors, he was a prodigy who could dismantle an argument in seconds. To his classmates, he was the boy who wore his pride as armor, using sarcasm as a sword. To the church, he was the outcast who mocked what they called sacred. That spring afternoon, the courtyard of the university was alive with voices of prayer. A group of students knelt in front of the bronze statue of the Virgin Mary. Her gaze was gentle, arms outstretched, as though holding every broken soul that walked past. Ethan stood at the edge of the crowd, his jaw tight, eyes blazing. For years, that statue had been a reminder of everything he hated: his rejection, his loneliness, his mother's silence when she discovered who he was. He didn't whisper. He didn't protest quietly. He walked straight into the circle of prayer. Dozens of heads turned. Rosaries slipped through anxious fingers. The air thickened. And then, without hesitation, he lifted his foot and drove it against the cold bronze. The clang rang out like thunder against still skies. Metal against shoe, faith against fury. The Virgin staggered not an inch, but the crowd did. Gasps rippled through the courtyard. Some screamed, others froze. Every heartbeat seemed to stop in unison. Emily, a sophomore clutching her rosary, remembered the sound echoing like a strike against her own chest. Phones lit up instantly, capturing the moment, framing Ethan as a villain before he could even take another breath. But what silenced the crowd wasn't the strike. It was the voice that followed. From the steps of the chapel, Father Gabriel emerged. He was old, with eyes that carried more sorrow than condemnation. His voice, calm yet heavy with meaning, cut through the noise. When you strike her, you also strike the heart of your own mother. The words pierced deeper than the taps of the crowd. Ethan froze, caught between rage and something he couldn't name. He clenched his fist as if daring the world to challenge him. Yet inside, something wavered. The defiance on his face was real, but so was the wound buried beneath it. What no one around him saw was that this act wasn't just rebellion. It was the roar of a boy who had been told too many times that he was a mistake. They thought Ethan was mocking faith, but in truth, he was fighting against a wound carved by a rejection for being gay, for being unloved, for never once hearing his own mother say he was enough. That courtyard fell into silence. But inside Ethan, storms raged. What began as defiance would soon become the beginning of a breaking he never imagined. And as you listen to Ethan's story here on Heart Stories, remember sometimes the loudest acts of rebellion are only cries for the love we never received. Stay with this journey, because what happened after that single strike would transform not only Ethan's life, but the way an entire community saw him. The sound of Ethan's foot against bronze had barely faded when the first video hit the internet. By nightfall, his name had spread across Springfield and beyond, carried not by whispers, but by furious captions and flashing headlines. Screens replayed the moment endlessly, his foot raised, the statue jolting from the strike, the shocked gasps of students caught in still frames of outrage. He was branded a blasphemer, a disgrace, the embodiment of everything wrong with his generation. On social media, comments flooded in faster than he could read them. Some called him the gay boy who spit on faith. Others labeled him lost, arrogant, a disgrace to his family. Memes mocked his smirk, while hashtags demanded his expulsion. In a matter of hours, Ethan's defiance turned into a cage. His name was trending, but not because of brilliance or intellect. It was chained to words meant to strip him of dignity. The local Catholic community rose in anger. Letters poured into the university board, demanding that Ethan be expelled. Parishioners called for punishment, some gathering outside the campus chapel with candles lit, praying not for him, but against him. At the same time, another group gathered quietly in corners of the internet, calling for prayer in a different way. They saw a boy lashing out from hurt, a young man crushed under a burden no one cared to understand. Their words were drowned in the louder chorus of condemnation, but they flickered like sparks against a night of fury. Ethan scrolled through the comments as though each line was another lash against his skin. He told himself he didn't care, that their hatred only proved his point. He laughed at the petitions, mocked the hashtags, and wore his defiance like armor. Yet even armor can splinter. That evening in the cafeteria, a group of students sat together watching the clip on repeat. One of them turned, his voice sharp with disgust. "You didn't just kick a statue. You kicked at the only thing that's ever held people like us together. You didn't just mock faith, you mocked a community. And don't pretend you don't know why. They pushed you out for being gay, and now you think you're striking back. But all you've done is prove them right." The words cut deeper than the comments online. Ethan's smile faltered. His stomach tightened. For a brief moment, his chest ached with a truth he didn't want to face. That night, sleep abandoned him. He drifted into a nightmare that wrapped around him like iron chains. He stood in darkness, endless and suffocating. Voices rose from the shadows. Familiar in their cruelty, slurs spat at him when he was younger. Whispers that had followed him since childhood. "Vju, lost boy, abomination." The words circled him like wolves. He tried to run, but the ground crumbled beneath his feet, pulling him into a pit of jeering laughter. Just as the void threatened to consume him, light broke through. A hand reached down, slender and trembling, pulling him upward. He looked into eyes that were not stern or condemning but filled with sorrow, wide and maternal. It was the face of the Virgin Mary, gentle, grieving, luminous. The same statue he had struck, now alive in his dream, pulling him out of the abyss. He woke with a agape, drenched in sweat, heart racing. The room was silent except for the echo of those eyes still fixed on him. He pressed his hands against his face, trembling not from rage this time, but from something unnameable: fear, confusion, longing. He wanted to dismiss it as nothing but the remnants of guilt. Yet deep in the eye, it felt like more. For the first time in years, Ethan found himself questioning whether the faith he ridiculed might hold a truth he couldn't escape. Not the sermons that rejected him, not the voices that mocked him, but the deeper truth that even in nightmares, a hand still reached for him. The viral shame had painted him as a villain, but in the shadows of his own mind, he was beginning to see himself as something else entirely, a boy who had been so desperate to be seen that he struck the very image of mercy reaching toward him. Sometimes, the harshest condemnation forces us to face not the world's cruelty, but the wounds we've carried alone. Ethan was beginning to learn that rebellion, no matter how loud, cannot silence the heart's unspoken cry for belonging. The day after the nightmare, Ethan walked through the streets of Springfield with his headphones in, blasting music loud enough to drown the lingering whispers of the night before. He told himself he was fine, that nothing had changed, that the dream meant nothing. But his steps betrayed him, restless and uneven, his mind looping back to the sorrowful eyes that had reached for him in sleep. As he crossed the busy intersection near campus, he barely noticed the rumble of an approaching truck. The world blurred into motion, and suddenly the blare of a horn ripped through the air. Tires screeched against asphalt. Ethan froze, caught in the path of steel and weight. For a split second, he saw the front grille rushing toward him, close enough to erase every thought. But before the impact came, he felt it, an unmistakable tug, like invisible hands pulling him backward. He stumbled onto the curb, the truck thundering past inches away, its wind knocking the breath from his lungs, shaking. Ethan sat on the sidewalk, staring down at the road where his body almost lay. And there, in the faint shimmer of heat rising from the asphalt, he thought he saw it, the shape of a hand pressed into light, fading as quickly as it appeared. He blinked hard, rubbed his eyes, but the vision lingered in his chest long after it vanished from sight. That night, alone in his dorm, the bravado crumbled. Ethan whispered words he never thought he would let himself speak. "Why did you save me?" He didn't know who he was asking: God, the statue, or the shadow of his own conscience. The words slipped out, not as a confession, but as a plea. It was the first time in years that his voice bent into something like prayer. Later, while wandering through the square, he found himself stopping at a flower stand. The woman behind it was old, her hands weathered from years of arranging petals that seemed far too delicate for a world so harsh. She began talking to him as if she had been waiting. She spoke of her son, how she had lost him in a car accident decades ago, and how in her grief she dreamed of the Virgin Mary cradling him, whispering that no child is ever abandoned. Her story was told with trembling lips and eyes wet with memory, and every word slid into Ethan's bones like echoes of his own nightmare. He stood there stunned, unable to explain how the dream she described mirrored his own vision. For the first time, he didn't have an argument ready. No clever dismissal, no sharp remark, only silence, and the throb of something breaking open inside him. As he walked away, his thoughts no longer raced with scorn. Instead, they slowed with questions he could not ignore. Could it be that the very faith he mocked was less about rules and rejection, and more about a love that stayed even when people failed? Could it be that mercy was reaching for him in ways he had tried so hard not to see? That night, sleep returned, lighter than before, and in the stillness, Ethan realized that near death does not only happen on highways. Sometimes it is the suffocation of carrying wounds too long, of being crushed under shame, of choosing to believe you are unworthy. Surviving that kind of death requires more than arrogance. It requires surrender to the possibility that something greater still wants you alive. Ethan didn't have the answers yet, but he was beginning to understand one truth: when the universe gives you another chance to breathe, it is not just survival. It is an invitation to start asking why your life is worth saving. The night air in Springfield carried a weight heavier than silence when Ethan returned to St. Mark's Parish. The courtyard was nearly empty, the lamps casting long shadows across the worn stone path. He stood in front of the statue he had once struck, its bronze surface still bearing the faint scratch of his anger. He stared at that mark, realizing it was a wound he himself had carved, and it stared back at him as though it belonged on his own heart. He didn't kneel. He didn't even move closer. He only stood there, frozen, trying to understand what was shifting inside him. And then, as if fate were listening, a little girl passed by with her parents. Her voice soft but steady as she glanced up at the statue. "She never leaves us, even when people hurt her." The words pierced him deeper than any accusation. For an instant, he was no longer in the courtyard but back in his childhood kitchen. Hearing his mother's voice on the day everything broke apart, she had stared at him with the same hard conviction the church had shown. Her words seared into his memory: "You are an abomination." That single sentence had become the cornerstone of his rebellion, the wound that shaped his defiance. The girl's whisper reopened it, but with a different blade. It carried not condemnation but innocence, a kind of belief he had long since abandoned. That night, sleep pulled him again into darkness. But this time the abyss was deeper, colder, filled with the same voices from his past. He fell endlessly, hearing the word abomination echo against unseen walls. It was his mother's voice now, layered with every sneer, every rejection, every laugh that mocked who he was. He fought against it, but the more he struggled, the further he seemed to fall. Then came the light, the same hand he had seen before, radiant against the void, reaching down for him. Her touch was gentle, not forcing, but inviting. He heard the words that had never once been spoken to him in life. "You are never abandoned." They were not thunderous, not loud, but tender enough to quiet the storm. The hand pulled him out, cradling him, not in power but in mercy. Ethan woke in tears, his pillow damp, his chest trembling with sobs he could no longer hold back. He didn't care if anyone heard him. For the first time, he admitted to himself what he had buried for years, that beneath his rage and pride, he had always longed for the embrace of a mother. It didn't matter if it came from the woman who had birthed him, or from the image of a Madonna he had once mocked. His soul had been screaming for love, and finally, he allowed himself to listen. He sat at his desk until dawn, clutching the memory of that voice. For the first time, he wasn't trying to prove anything. He wasn't fighting the church or his classmates or even his mother's absence. He was fighting the part of himself that believed he was unworthy of love. The breaking point doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it arrives in the quiet moment when you realize the very thing you rejected is the only thing still reaching for you. Ethan's anger had carried him far, but it could not carry him home. Only the willingness to be vulnerable could begin that journey. As the sun rose, he wiped his face and whispered words he had once sworn he'd never say, not a prayer of rebellion, not a cry of hatred, but the beginning of surrender to the truth that mercy and love are never as far as we imagine they are waiting, even when we don't believe we deserve them. Sunday morning arrived with a weight Ethan could not shake. The bells of St. Mark's Parish tolled through Springfield, echoing across the streets like an invitation he didn't feel ready for, but could no longer ignore. Each chime carried him closer to the place he had mocked, the place where his name had been cursed, and yet the place where something inside in him had begun to stir awake. He walked into the church slowly, as though every step might betray him. The pews were filled with familiar faces, students who had filmed his defiance, parishioners who had prayed against him, strangers who had seen his name dragged across headlines. Their eyes turned as he passed, and the silence felt heavier than any insult. He made his way to the front, where the bronze statue of the Virgin Mary stood, scarred by the strike of his foot. The scratch was still there, etched in metal like a scar across her face, a mark of his rebellion preserved in bronze. Ethan stopped just before her. The air was thick, every breath trembling. And then, as though his body refused to hold back any longer, he fell to his knees. The sound of his sobs broke the stillness, not sharp or defiant, but raw and desperate. Words poured out, fractured and fragile. "I'm sorry. Forgive me." The congregation didn't gasp this time. They didn't jeer. They looked at him not as a villain, but as a boy breaking open before something greater than himself. Their eyes softened, some with tears, some with sorrow, none with hatred. In that silence, there was no judgment, only recognition of a wound laid bare. Father Gabriel stepped forward. He placed a rosary into Ethan's shaking hands, his voice carrying the weight of truth rather than condemnation. "You do not carry this burden alone. A mother never turns from her child, even when that child is lost." Ethan clutched the rosary as though it were a lifeline, the beads slipping through his fingers, anchoring him to something he had run from all his life. The tears would not stop, but for the first time, he did not try to silence them. He let them fall freely, each drop washing away another layer of the pride that had kept him from admitting his deepest need. He did not leave the church transformed into a saint. He did not rise with answers to every question or with his anger fully dissolved. But something inside him had shifted. A door had opened. A boy once hardened by arrogance had begun, however imperfectly, to confront the wound of rejection. And in that moment, Ethan learned something he never could have found in philosophy lectures or arguments won. He learned that kneeling was not defeat. Kneeling could be healing. To bow was not to surrender to shame, but to open oneself to mercy. When he stepped outside into the sunlight, the world had not changed, but he had. And that was enough to begin again. He once said he would kneel to no one, yet mercy met his brokenness. And in the quiet of that church, Ethan discovered a truth he could not argue away. What about you? Do you believe that sometimes the very act we fear the most, falling to our knees, can be the place where healing begins? This was Ethan's story, shared with you by Heart Stories. If it moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more stories that remind us how mercy, love, and truth can change even the hardest of hearts.